So now we've looked at this process of trying to derive imperatives of duty, both perfect and imperfect duties, from the categorical imperative. Kant thinks this allows us some reasons to believe that the imperative exists, that his explanation of the causes of rational behavior are in fact plausible. So this sort of synthesis, this overarching synthesis of physical causality and rational causality that he's trying to achieve, at least as we can kind of make sense of it at this point. And so we can kind of see how people would proceed under the Kantian theory as moral agents, deriving moral imperatives from the categorical imperative. So whenever we want to act, we test the action by testing to see if the maxim that describes the action is internally consistent. Is it the sort of thing that if we were to make it a universal instinct, if we were to make it operate as if it were one of those physical laws that describe physically necessary relations between physical parameters, if we imagined our maxim operating like that, would it even be possible? Is it internally consistent? If it's not, it can't be universalized like that, then we know that it fails the test of the universal maxim, as I call it, the maxim that prohibits that action, that says you should not do that. That becomes an imperative of perfect duty that we derive from the categorical imperative. If it turns out that the behavior is consistent, it passes the test of the universal maxim, that is, we can imagine that it is a universal necessary instinct, so that all rational agents behave in accordance with the rules specified by the maxim, and that seems like it's not internally inconsistent, then we want to test it in accordance with the test of the universal will. So is it really possible that all creatures would will this to be a universal instinct, universal exceptionless rule about how to behave? If we say no, sometimes people would probably will that, sometimes they wouldn't, then we say, okay, well, that means it fails the test of the universal will, as I call it. Hence, the negated maxim, the maxim that prescribes that we don't engage in that original action. So in the case of, for instance, not helping people, the negated maxim prescribes we try to help people. That becomes an imperative of imperfect duty. So we're not obligated. It's a duty that we should strive towards, right? And so that negated maxim is something that when we do it, when we act in accordance with the actions it specifies, we're acting in ways that are morally praiseworthy, but not morally obligatory. We don't always have to act that way. We should strive to act that way. We don't always have to. If the maxim that describes the action is both universalizable as a universal and necessary instinct, all rational agents would behave that way in all appropriate situations, and we can see that that universalization would be universally willed in a consistent fashion, then it's consistent with the categorical imperative, and so it's an imperative of perfect duty. So Kant then ends this chapter by trying to sort of explain how it is that rational creatures fit into this world, how it is that we can understand rational agency in the context of a physically deterministic universe. And so he says, once we sort of understand, or at least find remotely plausible, this idea of rational imperatives, hypothetical and categorical, and we see how rational imperatives can act to impel rational action in certain circumstances, in the same way that physical laws, physical necessity causes the evolution of physical systems. All right, so just as gravity acts always to attract two objects in proportion to their mass and the square of the distance between them times the universal constant. It's also the case that the rational agent, grasping the rational necessity of an imperative, feels an impetus to behave in accordance with the dictates of the imperative. In doing that, Kant says, we have a notion of agency, how agents can be responsible for their actions, how they can be free in a physically deterministic world where everything that is physical is being caused in accordance with physical necessity. And, Kant says, we also understand what it is for rational agency, and we then understand that that has to be the basis of any legitimate moral theory. So any theory that hopes to explain agency and the normativity of actions, the moral value or disvalue of actions, has to do so by understanding rational agency, has to do so in a way that respects autonomy. And this ties in to Rachel's discussion of treating people as ends in themselves as opposed to means only. So when we treat people as ends in themselves, what we're doing is we're treating them as autonomous agents, as self-legislating beings capable of behaving rationally, that is, having behaviors that are impelled by the recognition of rational necessity. And insofar as we do not do that in how we treat other people or in how we think about moral rules, then we violate their autonomy. Therefore, we fail to treat them as ends in themselves, as rational agents. And so, for instance, when Rachel talks about Kant's versus the utilitarian notion of what punishing people for crimes is, right? So utilitarians, consequentialists, reformers, they say, look, what we should try to do when we inflict punishment on people is not, cause harm to them, but cause them to be reformed, change the way they operate. Kant says that's an immoral approach. We shouldn't do that. We should be punishing them because they need to suffer the consequences of their autonomous decisions. If we try and change them, then we're treating them as means only. We're not respecting them as self-legislating ends. We're violating their autonomy, undermining their ability to act in a free manner. His argument, not mine. Similarly, all right, when we think about how we approach ethics, the idea that Kant has is any ethical theory has got to come from the correct, in his view, his is the correct notion of what it is for a rational agent to act freely in a causally determined physical world, right? So any theory that tries to impose norms on people, right, where the normative authority doesn't come from their own self-legislation, violates their autonomy, treats them as means only, and hence is a spurious moral system. So hopefully going through, trying to present it, trying to follow the narrative in Kant's book gives you a better sense of Kant, the motivations for Kant, the concepts that he used, and how he saw them integrated, how he tried to defend them. Nothing wrong with the Rachel's material. Rachel's is a very insightful, very comprehensible writer, but his presentation, to my mind, doesn't help us understand Kant or why Kant advocates what he does, doesn't help us to see Kant as a figure from the Enlightenment. All of those things are kind of gone, and so I thought I'd try and present Kant's theory in a way that helps you to understand Kant and also understand deontological approaches to ethics. Right? So Kant's argument against heteronomy of ethical principles is really an argument for the deontological approach. Essentially, Kant is arguing that any approach that doesn't start from this conception of rational agents as self-legislators, as acting in accordance with laws of reason, right, from duty, is a misconceived and immoral approach to ethics. So it's a pretty strong, morally laced argument against other ethical theories. When we look at, what I'm hoping you'll take away from this, I hope that you'll have a better understanding of what Kant was trying to do, what his intellectual milieu was, how it motivated him in formulating his theory. I hope that specifically we understand what imperatives are, how they express laws of reason. We understand the difference between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Hopefully the discussion of problematic versus esoteric hypothetical imperatives helped you to understand imperatives better, helped you to understand what the difference between a hypothetical and a categorical imperative was, and helped you understand why Kant focused on categorical imperatives, or imperatives of duty derived from the categorical imperative, as the source of morality in this overarching project that attempts to unify explanations of all behaviors through a common methodology. Then, hopefully, we understand duties, understand how duties get derived from the categorical imperative via imperatives of duty. We understand the difference between perfect and imperfect duties, where perfect duties represent a perfectly universalizable maxim that could be consistently universally willed as a universal maxim, and an imperfect duty would represent a perfectly consistent behavior that represents the negation of a maxim that specifies a behavior that we couldn't consistently and universally will to be a general behavior. Finally, we have this notion of the will. We understand autonomy as the mechanism through which Kant explains both free will in a deterministic physical world, and how he goes about explaining rational agency and morality, and why he criticizes consequentialist theories, for instance, as being immoral ethical theories, theories that violate the autonomy and treat the agents as means only and not as ends in themselves.